Mrs. Clara Bastian of Morristown, New Jersey. For 33 years, I have been searching for my daughter. I belong to Dick Christian, a wealthy country gentleman who lived near Charles City Courthouse in Virginia. In 1859, Mr. Christian sold me and my 12-year-old daughter Patience because he owed money. Patience. She was a very bright little girl. And as we were taken to the marketplace to be sold, I prayed that wherever we would go together. I was sold first to Ben Davis, a slave trader, and my daughter was sold to a stranger. I fell on my knees before Mr. Davis and begged him to buy my daughter from the stranger. His heart must have been touched by my agony because he walked over to the stranger and offered to buy my Patience. But the stranger refused to sell her. And he went away a few hours later. I have never seen my daughter since. She was last seen near Charles City Courthouse. Mrs. Clara Bastian.
Mr. Editor, I desire to inquire for my kin people. I am the daughter of Somerset and Lucy Green. I had two sisters, Mary and Lucy Green. We all belonged to George Matthews, a lawyer, and lived in Cumberland County, Virginia. I was sold in 1848 for $1,750 and taken to Louisiana. My present name is Ann Brewers, and my home is in Carrollton, Louisiana. Should any person read this who can give me any information as to either of the persons above named, I should be truly thankful to have them address me at Carrollton, Louisiana. Ann Brewers.
Mr. Editor, I wish to find my people. Mother was Lucy Setz, and sisters were Martha, Mary Jane, and Julia Setz. They were sold to Jack Godden at the Jack Godden sale. The man that bought me was Jazz Hickbottom. My mother moved to the back streets of Lynchburg, Virginia, at the beginning of the war. She went to Baltimore, and I haven't heard of them since. Address Setz, care of Reverend L. Felder, Bryan, Texas.
Do you know them? My two sisters and two brothers were sold at Mrs. Sally Powell's sale in Frankfort County, Virginia, about 12 miles from Rocky Mount, about the year of 1851. Ike and Charles were the boys' names, and Drusilla and Victoria were the girls' names. I am their younger brother, Edward Johnson. My father's name was Isaac, and my mother's name was Prudence. Anyone knowing of these parties will please address Edward Johnson, 7 Gorham Ave, Brookline, Massachusetts.
Wants to find sister. Mr. George Newells wants to find his sister Martha Newells. They parted over 40 years ago at Pine Bluff, Arkansas. She went to Tuscumbia, Alabama. He lives in Pittsfield, Arkansas.
Mr. Editor, I wish to inquire for my brothers, Daniel, James, and David Myers. We were sold apart in Hancock, Maryland County, Virginia. My name then was Myers, but now I'm Johnson. Please inquire at Reverend C.C. McGinnigan at St. Paul's Methodist Episcopal Church in Galveston, Texas. To the editor of the Christian Reporter, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, August 31st, 1872. Information wanted of my mother, Fanny Webb, formerly who lived near or at the Union Wharf on the Rappahannock River, Richmond County, Virginia, opposite the lighthouse. She belonged to a Samuel Stoneham and afterwards to an Edward Saunders, who sold her to a trader by the name of Dan from Richmond City, Virginia. From there, she was sold south about 27 or 28 years ago. I was brought to Missouri by James Newby and Samuel Stoneham. Any information of her or her children, Fanny, Elizabeth, or Alexander, will be thankfully received by her son, Adam Sisson, St. Joseph, Missouri. P.S. I will pay $25 cash to any party who will give me information by which I can find her.
I wish to find my two sons, Stephen and Albert G. The last heard from them, they were in St. Louis. For information, send it to this paper or to me, Mrs. Lydia G., 47 Roof Street, Memphis, Tennessee.
Information wanted on my father and uncle. My father's name is Henry Washington, and my uncle's name is Joseph. They were sold for some chestnuts 40 years ago on the estate of Andrew Mills on Johns Island, South Carolina. Please address Joseph Washington, Lincolnville, South Carolina.
Robert Brown, son of Harriet Brown, formerly owned by Miss Cornelius Lucas of Falmouth, Stafford County, Virginia. Wants the name and address of anyone who knows the whereabouts of his grandfather, Elijah Brown, his granduncle, Edward Brown, and his brother, William Brown, or any information that will lead to their discovery. These relatives all at one time belonged to Miss Cornelius Lucas of Falmouth, Virginia. Address WRB Hot Springs, South Dakota.
I desire to know the whereabouts of my relatives. I was sold from them during the war. I belonged to Sandwich, who lived at that time in Richmond, Virginia. I was sold to Jefferson at an age between 11 and 12 years. Then I was sold to Robert Gallagher and Bird Leatherwood, two Negro traders. They carried me to Mississippi. Ike Beecham, the brother of Sam Beecham, sold me for the depth of said Sam. My mother's name was Nellie Beecham. I left Virginia and I have not seen her since. My uncle's name was Louis Beecham and the other uncle, Pompey Beecham. My sister's name was Jane Beecham. She was sold to a white woman. Her name is Jeanette. The rest are unknown. She was carried to Baltimore. My name was Gustus Ann Beecham, and my name is now Gustus Ann Hamilton. Any information will be thankfully received by addressing me at Coffeyville, Kansas.
Information wanted of George Myers and Mary Myers, who are my mother and father, and George Myers, Jr., Miles Myers, and Jane Myers, my brothers and sister, formerly of Charleston, Missouri. They left Missouri in the fall of 1861 and came to Columbus, Kentucky, where they remained a short time. And from there, they came to Cincinnati, Ohio. And the last time they were heard of, they were situated somewhere near Dayton, Ohio. Any information in regard to any or all of the above persons will be thankfully received by their son and brother, Israel Myers, who is now attending school in Oden, April 13th.
Mr. Editor, I wish your aid in finding my brothers Richard and Samuel Gardner. My name was Eliza Gardner. We lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and at that time my brother Samuel followed steamboated. There was another brother of us, but I cannot remember his name. I was a nurse at a hotel with a Mrs. Davis. I was stolen and sold to Major Gibson in this country. Any information you can give, reach me at Pickens Station, Miss A. Lemons.
editor of the Andrew County Republican, Savannah, Missouri, November 22nd, 1872. Information wanted by me, Adam Sisson, otherwise Adam Webb, regarding the whereabouts of my mother, Fanny Webb. She was sold to a slave trainer by the name of Dix, taken to Richmond, Virginia, and again sold and taken to Alabama about 24 years ago. I was taken from my mother when I was 6 years old, and I am now 34, and have been in search of her for 28 years. Since emancipation, I have spent every cent I could save, about $400, advertising and traveling in search of her. Any information of her or her children, Fanny, Elizabeth, or Alexander, will be thankfully received by her son, Adam Sisson. P.S. I am now employed as a porter and can be reached at the Pacific Hotel, Buchanan County, Missouri.
Dear Editor, I desire to inquire for my people in St. Charles County, Missouri. Mother was Pearline, stepfather was Sam. My mother had 2 sets of children. There were 5 of us. 2 of them died before I left home. The oldest, Sophronia, was sold first. There was Franny, Anderson, Morgan, and myself. Parents belonged to John Oden. The old man and I was sold to Mr. Corral.
Do you know them? I would like to find my people. I was born near Hampton, Virginia, owned by Lewis Davis. He had a brother named Robert Allen Davis. My mother's name was Patsy Reed. Her husband was Bob Reed. I have 2 sisters somewhere, Becky and Caroline. I have 1 sister living in Virginia. Her address is Sally Curtis, Hampton, Virginia. When I left my native home, I was about 9.5 years old. A man bought me named Goodbar. He took me to Norfolk, Virginia, and put me in jail at night. He then took me to Richmond, Virginia, and sold me to Silas McHunder, who sold me to Robertson in Mobile, Alabama. He sold me to Judge Perkins in Louisiana. My 2 brothers were John and Frederick. John married a lady by the name of Jenny Payne. I married Henry Meade of Louisiana. He came from or near Petersburg, Virginia. Had a daughter named Mary Liza Meade and Henrietta Meade. Their mother was named Rosa Meade. Harry Meade was killed in Texas by a mob. Rosa and Millie were Harry's sisters. If anyone can give me any information, please address Lucy Meade or her son, Sandy Anderson, Mineola, Wood County, Texas.
Information wanted of Laura Collins of Leesburg County, Virginia. She was owned by James Thomas. She ran away during the war. Her mother's name was Ann Collins. She belonged to Dr. Edwards of Leesburg County. I heard she was in Canada, Ontario. She is married, but I don't know her marriage name is. Any information of her whereabouts will be thankfully received by her niece, Lizzie Collins, 320 South Juniper Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Ministers in Canada will please read this to their congregations.
Mr. Editor, I desire to inquire for my brother, who was sold from us before I recollect, or was old enough to remember him. His name was George. He belonged to Widow Tyndall. At the time, we lived in Robertson County, Texas. His mother was Maria Tyndall. My name is Ned. I had another brother named Mallory, who also belonged to Widow Tyndall. My brother was sold to Jesse Brown, who lived at Wheelock, Texas. Brown sold him to Mr. Robertson, I think, who lived near Huntsville, Texas.
and I have not heard from him since. He left us in 1857 or 1858. Mother does not know exactly when. Address, J.E. Carrington, Augie, Leon County, Texas.
My name, I am Myrtle Royal, Virginia Lecter. I want to learn where I can find my grandparents, who lives or who live in or near Virgil, Virginia. My father's name was Lean Royal Lecter. He had two brothers named Jack and John Lecter. And he had three sisters, Molly, Max, and Lizzie Lecter. All letters shall be addressed to me. Myrtle, Virginia Lecter, St. Marco, Texas.
And Mistress married again and carried me off to Kentucky. My people were living in St. Charles County, Missouri, when I was sold for cutting off the 2 fingers of my young boss. It has been 26 years since I heard or saw my people. Then I was sold from Kentucky to New Orleans. My last owner was Mrs. Moore. Write to me at Union M.E. Church, New Orleans, care of Reverend S. Priestley, Clarissa Reed.
To the heirs of George Hazard, colored, deceased. Information is wanted concerning Nancy and Robert Hazard, colored, or their heirs. The said Nancy and Robert were sold as slaves in Virginia many years ago. If they or their heirs can be found, they may learn something to their advantage by applying to S. Harvey Thomas, 312 Walnut Street, Philadelphia.
Wanted. Information of Henry Dales, colored. He will hasten to his advantage by calling at 110 Jefferson Street, Memphis, Tennessee.
Mr. Editor, I wish to inquire for my father and brother, who were sold in 1840. They belonged to a man by the name of Leonard Eaglehart. They were sold to the South. I do not know who bought them, for I was too small to remember much. My father's name was Isaac Seymour, and my mother, Emma Seymour. They had 6 children. Their names were John, Louis, Harriet, Garlis, Daniel, and Sophia. My father and brother were from Anne Arundel County, 9 miles from Baltimore, Maryland. Brother Gattus went to the army. I do not know what became of him. Any information will be thankfully received. Address Harriet McCarney, San Antonio, Texas.
Nathaniel Dunmore, Oral, West Virginia, desires the address of any soldier who knew anything pertaining to the time and death of Edmund Dunmore, colored, who enlisted from the state of Pennsylvania.
Information wanted of John Warren Watts, colored. When last heard from, he was at Petersburg in hospital, wounded in right arm. A note directed to his mother, Agnes Watts, will be received if left at Mr. Jackson's corner of Baltimore and Spring Street.
Information wanted of Christopher Jones, sometimes called John Allen, formerly of Baltimore. He is about 24 years of age, medium height, light complexion, curly hair, gray eyes, and stout build. He enlisted in March 1865 in the 2D United States Colored Cavalry. When last heard from, he was in New Orleans. Any information respecting him will be thankfully received by his mother, Mrs. Redelia Jones, number 25 Edward Street, Baltimore, Maryland. Ministers will please read this from their pulpits in New Orleans churches.
I'm Mrs. Clara Bastian of Morristown, New Jersey. For 33 years, I have been searching for my daughter Patience. I was carried to Charleston, South Carolina, and sold again. As the war came, I was sold from one master to another, passing through Alabama and Mississippi. I was owned at Carrollton, Mississippi, when emancipation came. All the while, I thought of my daughter Patience. I begged each master to write letters back to the Charles City Courthouse in Virginia to find out any information. Some did, others did not. But no news ever came of my missing girl. She was last seen near Charles City Courthouse. Mrs. Clara Bastian, Carrollton, Mississippi.
Information wanted by a mother concerning her children, Mrs. Elizabeth Williams, who now resides in Marysville, California, was formerly owned together with her children, Lydia, William, Allen, and Parker, by one John Petty, who lived about 6 miles from the town of Woodbury, Franklin County, Tennessee. At that time, she was the wife of Sandy Rucker and was known as Betsy, sometimes called Betsy Petty. About 25 years ago, the mother was sold to Mr. Marshall Stroud and taken to Arkansas. She has never seen the above children since. Any information given concerning them, however, will be gratefully received by one whose love for her children survives the bitterness and hardships of many long years spent in slavery. Preachers in the neighborhood of Woodbury, Tennessee, are especially requested to make inquiry and communicate any information they may deem valuable, either by letter or through the columns of the recorder.
Someone please send me the whereabouts of one Mrs. Belly Chapman, the sister of F. Betts. Wait, stop. Someone please tell me the whereabouts of one Mrs. Belly Chapman, the sister of Ben F. Betts. Of Nashville. Write me at Katie IT in the Blodge, King Lee Chapman.
Do you know her? I would like to know the whereabouts of my daughter, Lily Clements. She left Richmond 4 years ago with Brandon Norris for Yonkers, New York, after which she moved to East Orange, New Jersey. The last I heard of her, she was in New York. Any information will be thankfully received by her mother, Mrs. Caroline Clements, 58412 Catherine Street, Richmond, Virginia.
Information wanted of my brothers, Thomas and Major Ross, sons of Richard and Ann Ross. They were born slaves in Calvert County, Maryland, and ran off from their mistress, Mrs. Bliss Robbins. Any information as to their whereabouts will be thankfully received by their brother, J.M. Ross, Cadiz, Ohio.
I wish to inquire for my relatives, father, mother, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, grandmother, and grandfather. We all lived in Virginia. Mothers and children belonged to David Nolan at or near Flint Hill, Rappahannock County. Mother was Emily and father Henry Williams. He belonged to Gibb Fletcher and lived in London County. Mother and father were both sold long before the war, down south and apart. My three brothers were James, George, and Henry Williams. James was sold about 8 years before the war to a man in Baltimore the last time I heard of him. My sister was Sarah, my name Mary Ellen Williams, but I am married and am now Mary Ellen Chapman. Sister was sold south too, and brother George and Henry were sold with me. We lived together until the close of the war. We were first sold to a runner, and he sold us to Mr. Williams, who moved with us to Mobile, Alabama. After the war, my brother George left, and I have never seen or heard of him since. And brother Henry lives with me yet. My grandfather was George Roots, grandmother Sarah, and my aunt Ellen Roots. Uncles were George, James, and Philip Roots. My grandfather bought all of his family but my mother and Uncle Philip at Flint Hill, Virginia, and moved all of them to Muskingum County, Ohio. I heard that Uncle George Roots was living in Greene County, Ohio. Grandfather bought all from David Nolan long before the war, and the last I heard from them, they were all living in Zanesville, Ohio. I have never heard anything of my mother, father, brother James, and sister Sarah since the war. I heard that Uncle Philip was sold to a man in Kentucky before the war. Address in care of H. Adams, number 237, Howard Street, New Orleans, Louisiana. Mary Ellen Chapman.
I would like to know the whereabouts of Mrs. Eliza Clark, formerly Mrs. Eliza Husher. My history is a peculiar one. I saw in the Freeman that Mrs. Eliza Clark was looking for her sister, Sally Clark, and her brothers, Tip, Toby, and the rest of her brothers. Well, Sister Sally Clark is my grandmother, and I, Lucy Johnson, am the only granddaughter surviving. And I have 2 brothers alive. My grandmother had 9 children, who are all dead. The last of all died 4 years ago in May. My grandmother has been dead 8 years. When she was alive, she would tell me about her relations in America.
Do you know them? Information is desired concerning the relatives of Samuel Burton, who died at Saginaw, Michigan, leaving some money. He worked at Montgomery, West Virginia, and was said to have a sister, Angeline Fisher, who lived at Ford's Mill, Roanoke County, Virginia. He is said to have an aunt at Edgewater, Fayette County, West Virginia. Any information will be gladly received by F.H. Porterfield in care of Saginaw Coal Company, Saginaw, Michigan.
Information wanted to know the whereabouts of Sally Clark, if living. Also her children, my brothers and sisters, Nancy, Caroline, Robert, Tip, Toby, Frank, Samuel, and Aaron Clark. All of whom were taken south by Negro traders from this county in 1862 and 63. Address, Mrs. Eliza Husher, formerly Eliza Clark.
I am the son of Thomas Jackson, who immigrated to Liberia from Baltimore about 1830. My father is said to have had a sister by the name of Lydia Jackson, who remained in Baltimore. He also had a son, Plato Jackson by name, who went to Ohio or some other place in the West. I shall be glad to hear of the whereabouts of any of these people or their descendants. Any information concerning the same will be cheerfully received by John P. Jackson, care of the Weekly Record, Breadfruit Lane, Lagos, West Africa.
Mr. Edward, I wish to inquire of my son. He left me in Selma, Alabama in 1873. His name is Tony Roberts. At one time he went by the name Tony Johnson. But when he came to live with me after the emancipation, I informed him that his father's name was Tony Roberts. I suppose he goes by the name Roberts now. After he came to live with me from Louisiana, we left. We lived for a time at Green's Place in Dallas County, Alabama. We then moved to Selma, Alabama, where he left me, and I've not heard from him since. Any information of his whereabouts will be thankfully received. Address me, Celia Johnson, at Vicksburg, Mississippi, in care of Inquire Church.
Mr. Editor, please allow me space in the consolidating paper once more to inquire for the whereabouts of my father's daughter, whom he left in Virginia. He said he left them when he was quite young, about 16 years old, I suppose. He left people in Richmond, Virginia, was sold to traders and brought to New Orleans, Louisiana, and sold to a man by the name of A.G. Jordan, who he served until freedom, who farmed on Red River lands at the village now known as Hammer, 7 or 8 miles from the river, 5 miles from Spanish Lake. My father has not seen or heard of any of his people since he left Richmond. He said there were 4 brothers of them and 3 sisters, whose names were as follows: John, James, or Jesse, and himself, William Price. Don't remember the sister's name. My father has been dead 4 years. I was not with him when he died, but when he left me, he told me to inquire until I found his people. He also left a father and a mother in Virginia. E.J. Price, Fortson, Louisiana.
Will Kitty Collins, colored, who came from the Eastern Shore about 2 years ago. Please send her address to her brother. Direct to Box 580, Baltimore Post Office.
Information wanted. Any information leading to the whereabouts of Mrs. Della Moore. Her husband was named Jack Moore. She was last heard from in Pensacola, Florida. I.Z. Moore, Jeff, Alabama.
When my grandmother was alive, she told me about her relations in America. She told me that she was sold to a slave buyer with 200 other slaves, and they were bound for New Orleans. On board the ship, there were 2 white men who were ill-treated, and they agreed with the slave men that as soon as they reached the hole in the wall, they would take the captain and the crew and bound them in irons and set sail for Nassau. They did so, and by so doing, my grandmother and many more were landed in Nassau. Many who came over are dead, but some are still living. This is how we came to be in Nassau. I would like to inform Mrs. Eliza Clark that she is Mrs. Eliza Husher, and I would be glad if she would write to me or to the Freeman. May God bless the Freeman and all of its undertakers. Address all letters to Lucy A. Johnson, Nassau, Bahamas.
My father, William Edgerster, was born in Richmond, Virginia, 1841 and was sold to Mr. John Witherspoon in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky in 1849. His mother's name was Martha Ann Page Crump Edgester. She afterwards married a Cox. Her children were named John and Chastine Cox. John Cox married a lady by the name of Polly, and a child by the name of Henry was born to them. If anyone knows of the whereabouts of any of them, or can furnish any information, please write Mrs. James Oakley, 214 14th Street, New Albany, Indiana.
Mr. Editor, I wish to inquire for my brother, sold in the year 1856. He belonged to Mrs. Sarah McDonald, the widow of Big Jack, near Lynchburg, Sumter District, South Carolina. His father was Gabriel, his mother, Maria, his eldest brother, Joseph, and eldest sister, Caroline. The name of the one I am inquiring for is Harvey. He went off in company with a man named Williams. When I last heard of him, he was in Louisiana. Any information of him will be gladly received and rewarded. Address, J. Wilfred White, Pastor, Florence, South Carolina.
Information wanted of a brother and a sister. My sister's name was Susan Smith. I did not know my brother's name. After the death of our parents, we were separated, and I was carried off to Baltimore, Maryland, by my Aunt Mary Parker, to my Aunt Clara Dixon, who lived at the time in Park Lane, now called Little Mapledry Street. My Aunt Clara bound me about a year or two before she died. I also had an uncle who lived in Philadelphia and was a minister in the AME Connection. His name was Cedric Bass. My aunt had two sons, Jared Dixon and Benjamin Harris, who lived in Philadelphia. Please address Mary Harris, 40 West 38th Street, New York City, New York.
To the churches in Louisiana, a letter to be read in the churches inquiring for a man named Susan Spriggs, mother named Fannie Willis from Richard in Gloucester County, Virginia, Richard Cook in Gloucester County. My father was Susan Spriggs, known as Uncle John Stubbs, Ann Stubbs' father, and to inquire for my cousins, Edward and Mary Smith. Aunt Jenny Lewis belonged to McConnor in Williamsburg. Edward belonged to Dr. Bird in Gloucester. Please read this letter in all the churches. Susan's sister was sold before Richard Cook died. Susan's sister was named Ellie Green. James Green's wife was sold out of Richard Cook. State, if any of Ann Stubbs' relations can be heard of, please write to Yorktown to Ann Washington. I am married now. My mother's name is Lucy Stubbs, that Uncle John Stubb had for his wife. Our uncle got drowned one night coming home from Pinter Ponter Swamp. He was named Watts Harris. He belonged to Richard Cook, Gloucester. I want to hear from my relations if they can be found anywhere in the world.
Dear editor, I write to inform good news. Mrs. James Oakley. Oh, P.S. My uncle was right here in Indiana, 140 miles away from me in Brazil.
I would like to find my relatives. I was born in Somerset County, Maryland. My name is Henry Anderson, and my master was John Anderson of Eastern Shore, Maryland. I left about 6 years before the war. My mother's name was Peggy. My brother's names were Chaz, Horace, Alex, and Sandy. I left 2 sisters in Maryland, Sarah Ann and Melinda. I had a brother named Gio, who was drowned at Montgomery, Alabama, on the Alabama River. John Anderson, my master, died in Baltimore before I left Maryland, but he was brought home. His wife was named Leah Jane Anderson. She had children named John Wesley and Lemuel Anderson, Mary Elizabeth Cornelia, and Louisa Anderson. I had an aunt named Harriet. She was married to Simon Parker. My cousins were Moses, Daniel, Lot, and Ike. My aunt did belong to Mary Adams. I was sold to John Sanders, and was afterwards sold to Judge Perkins of the state of Louisiana. Any information will be gladly received. Address Henry or Sandy Anderson, Mineola, Texas, Wood County.
Information wanted of my brother, Charles Taylor, an inmate of the Colored Orphan Asylum, New York, during the year 1858, since which date I have heard nothing of him. Address his only sister, Dora Taylor, 1511 Burton Street, Philadelphia.
I, Henry Anderson, am now living in Texas, formerly of Somerset County, Maryland. I have found my long-lost friends and relatives through the help of the Freeman.
Mr. Editor, I desire to inquire for my sister. She left us in Georgia, 2 miles from Alatoona. She left this place and went to the ironworks to the man who she belonged to, named Bird Henry. This was the last time I heard from her, and was in the year 1855. At this time, she went by the name of Liza Tracy. Tracy bought her from Leonard Huff. We all belong to Huff. My mother's name is Leanne Huff, father's Sam Huff. I am the oldest daughter. My name was Becky Huff. Next oldest was Liza Huff, who is now absent from us. Next oldest brother Aaron. Next Vina Huff. Next Miriam Tom Huff. Next Valentine Huff. Next Amelia Huff. Next Frank Huff. Next Tennessee Huff. There were 9 of us, but Sister Liza is absent. When Leonard Huff took us to Texas, we came to Caldwell County in the year 1856. We have been here ever since. I am married now and go by the name Becky Henry. I'm married since the emancipation. If anyone knows anything about Sister Liza, please address me at Loving, Texas, Caldwell County, care of Samuel Huff. Becky Henry.
Lost friends found, amen. Mr. Editor, I noticed an inquiry in the column for lost friends for one Sims Johnson, for his sons as follows: William, James, George, and Hiram. I am his son, William, I think, for that is my father's name, and also my brother's names. He failed to give his post office address. He only said he lived in the eastern part of Mississippi, and that is where my father went when he left Texas. Please ask him to give his post office address, or write me as follows: William Johnson, Marwood Falls, Texas.
Information wanted. William Valentine, now named William Robertson, who was once a slave in Baltimore. and now living in New Bedford, wishes to know where his brother is, who was a slave in the same place, but came from Baltimore about 3 years since to Philadelphia. His name was Joshua Valentine, but he received the name of Daniel Cromwell. The desired information, if it can be given to anyone, may be sent to the Anti-Slavery Office, 21 Cornhill.
Mr. Editor, please allow me to inquire through your columns for my two brothers. The oldest, Joseph Lee, formerly belonged to a man by the name of Hartswell Truman, who lived in Henry County, Tennessee. Dear brother, if this reaches you, I am your sister. Your mother's name was Julia Freed. My name is Jenny Hutcherson. I have not seen you in 6 years. You was then at Connor in Henry County, Tennessee. That was the county seat. You may write me to this place, Locksburg, Arkansas. My youngest brother's name is James Freeman, and formerly belonged to a Mr. Jack Freeman. You left us in time of war. I have not seen you since. Last I heard of you, you were in Paris, Tennessee. Your answer will find me at Locksburg, Arkansas. Your sister, Jenny Hutcherson.
I'm Mrs. Clara Bastian of Morristown, New Jersey. For 33 years, I've been searching for my daughter Patience. Once I was free, I began the search on my own. For many years, I could not leave Mississippi, for I earned but little money, not enough to take me back to Virginia, where I last saw Patience. But I wrote letters, and my friends wrote letters too. When I'd saved enough money to travel back to Virginia, I discovered that my former master was dead, and that the war had swept away old landmarks and old recollections. No one knew of my daughter Patience, or the name of the man who had bought her, but still I was determined to find her. I cooked and sewed and did housework to earn money for my search. I traveled through Virginia, Kentucky, Alabama, South Carolina, and the far South searching for my daughter. I put advertisements in the newspapers, and I paid the colored preachers to state the case in their churches before their congregations, in order that one person might tell the story to another to spread the news of my search. She was last seen near Charles City Courthouse. Mrs. Clara Bastian, Richmond, Virginia.
Mr. Editor, kind sir, I desire to inquire through your paper for my mother. Her name is Louisa, but she was called Lucy. She used to belong to Judge James of Galveston, Texas. Her mother was named Rebecca Thomas, and she belonged to the Shaws. Her brothers were named John, Dan, and Dennis, and her sisters were Mary and Eliza. They all came from Baltimore to Galveston. She was sold from me when I was very small. The old lady that took care of me was called Aunt Judy, so I was called Judy too, but ever since emancipation, my grandmother named me after my mother, Louisa. I was her only child when she left Galveston. She was taken away by Mr. Town Powell, and I think she was carried to Brownsville, Texas. I will turn my thanks and ask the blessings for the Lord to rain upon you or any friends that will help me inform the whereabouts of my dear mother. I am married now, and now living in Richmond. My name is Louisa Oden. I am very anxious to hear something of my mother. She is living or dead, or if she has any children. Please address Louisa Oden, Richmond, Fort Bend County, Texas.
Lost relative, I would like to know the whereabouts of my daughter, Mary Ella Clark. I was
sold from her to a man by the name of Squire Killer Bruce, near Paris, Tennessee. My name then was Little Maria Clark. I also have a sister, Cherry Clark. Any information about my daughter will be thankfully received by Mrs. Maria Dawson, Mound City, Illinois.
Lost relative. My mother's name was Matilda Levy. When I last saw her, she was in Plum Plains, Maryland. I was sold from her 3 years before the war. My master's name is James Nasley. Any information be gladly received by Sally Henry, 403 West 90th Street, Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Information wanted of my mother, Rachel Embry. My name was Henrietta Embry when I was taken from home. I left my mother in Baltimore, Maryland, and came to Texas with Ruth and Bereaved. My name is Henrietta Anderson. Anyone who can tell me where my mother is, I will reward them. Address me, Care Reverend W.H. Anderson, San Angelo, Greene County, Texas.
I wish to inquire for my relatives, whom I have not heard from since 1857. My mother's name was Eliza Oden, who belonged to a man named George Higgins, who lived in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. My father's name was William Oden, who belonged to a man named Hall, who also lived in Anne Arundel County. My mother died in August 1855, and my father died in September 1855. There were 4 brothers: William Oden, who I left in the city of Baltimore, Maryland in 1857. Charles Oden, I left at home in Anne Arundel County in 1857. He was sold about the year 1860. Last I heard of him, he was in Ohio, married, and had 2 children. London Oden, my youngest brother, I left in Maryland, or somewhere traveling with the white people. I was sold in 1857 to a speculator who brought me to Alabama. I had a sister, Catherine Oden. She married a man named Hawkins, living in Washington City, D.C. The ministers will confer a great favor on me by reading this notice from their pulpits. Address me at Refuge, Mississippi, Reverend J. N. Oden.
Mr. Editor, I wish to inquire for my children. Their given names are Clark Wesley, Alan Jackson, and Mary Ann. Clark Wesley's father was Abraham Perry, belonging to Samuel Perry, who lived in St. Louis. I left Clark Wesley 3 miles above St. Louis on the dairy farm of Dr. John G. Bryant with Thomas Bryant, the doctor's cousin. The father of Alan Jackson and Mary Ann was Jack Bryant, and all belonged to Dr. Bryant. I left Jack Bryant and my children, Alan and Mary, in 1845 in the lead mines in a little town called Potosi, 75 miles below St. Louis. I was Dr. Bryant's cook, Charlotte Bryant, and was brought out by Jenny Jenkins, Major Curl and Company, to Mississippi, and then from this to Lockhart, Caldwell County, Texas, where I have lived ever since with Mr. Crockett Harbor.
Information wanted. My wife, Rebecca Bishop, deserted me and our 3 children last Monday night, the 3rd instant. She was accompanied by a mulatto boy named Jerry, formerly slave of one Bishop. Said boy is about 25 years of age, slightly cross-eyed in one eye. My wife is 36 years old, but looks much younger. She has a mole on the chin, which is quite noticeable. Information from anyone, white or colored, will be gratefully appreciated. Any intelligence can be sent to me or left at the printing office. July 12th, 13th, J.U. Bishop.
Mr. Editor, please allow me some space in your columns to inquire for some lost friends of mine who've been separated from me since early life. My mother's name was Martha Ann and belonged to John Scroggins and lived in Rutherford County, Tennessee, near Murfreesboro on Bradley Creek. Mr. Editor, we Methodists know where the old Shiloh Church stands. Lived near that place, but moved to Missouri about the year 1844 to Morgan County and was sold to a man named Daniel Dale, and shortly moved to Texas. My two sisters were named Jemima and Eliza. I have three brothers whose names are Daniel, Abraham, and Peter. My name is Samuel Mango Scroggins, but properly known by the name of Samuel Scroggins. My dear old mother was known to be a good and faithful member of the M.E. Church. But as to brothers and sisters, I cannot say, but I will endeavor to pray for them. As I professed religion at the age of 14 years and joined the M.E. Church, and I'm a pastor of that church, and I will try to do my whole duty and hope that pastors will read this letter from their pulpits. Address me as Sherman, Grayson County, Texas, from Samuel Scroggins.
Information wanted of my mother. I was parted from her about the year 1852 and sold to a speculator by the name of Alex Hopkins and was brought to Georgia. She only had 2 children at the time. My name is Patience, and my sister's name was Pilsey. My mother's name is Harriet, and at the time was owned by William Harrison of Nash County, North Carolina. My marriage name is now Patience Arnett. Please help me to find her. Post Office, Mitchelton, Georgia.
Mr. Editor, I wish to inquire for my mother's people, whom she left in Norfolk, Virginia. Her mother's name was Betsy Ridley. Her father, Thomas Mosley. Sisters, Lizzie, Georgiana, brother, William. She was sold from Ridley to Ruskin, and he sold me to a Negro trader by the name of Mr. Hall. I left them in 1850 or 51 and was taken to Mississippi, and I have not heard from them since. My name at that time was Katie Ridley. I now go by the name of Catherine Strong. Address me at Aberdeen, Mississippi, care of W.T. Strong.
Information wanted of my daughter, Fannie Lane, who used to belong to Mr. Adele Lane of the Ferry Plantation near Lane's Ferry. Her mother was then known as Sophia Lane, but now as Sophia Copeland. Elijah Lane was her father. Her sisters and brothers were Martha Jane, Sarah, Elijah, Caesar, and Frank. Fannie left Rocky Point, North Carolina with Eddie Lane's widow. Any information of her whereabouts will be gladly received by her mother, Sophia Copeland. I am a member of the AME Church at Rocky Point, North Carolina. Please address care of my pastor, Reverend J.H. Robbins, Rocky Point, North Carolina.
Do you know these? I would like to know the whereabouts of my brother, Lias Tibbs, who belonged to Mrs. Moore Carter. He left Warrenton, Tarkir County, 85 years ago and was sold. His father's name was Adam Tibbs, mother's name Lucy Tibbs. He had a brother named George Tibbs, who also had another by the name of Beverly Tibbs, who was the youngest one. Anyone knowing anything of his whereabouts would kindly notify his brother, George Tibbs, 19 Cross Street, Montclair, New Jersey.
Information wanted of
children of Haver Outlaw, who went from Wake Forest. 3 of them, their names being Cherry, Viney, and Mills Outlaw, were bought by Abram Hester. Noah Outlaw was taken to Alabama by Joseph Turner Hillsburg. John Outlaw was sold to George Vaughn. Eli Outlaw was sold by Joseph Outlaw. He acted as watchman for old David Outlaw. Thomas Renbury Outlaw was taken away by William Outlaw. Julia Outlaw was sold in New Orleans by Dr. Outlaw. I live in Raleigh, and I hope they will think enough of their mother to come and look for her, as she is growing old and needs help. She will be glad to see them again by her side. This place is healthy, and they can do well here. As the hand of time steals over me now so rapidly, I wish to see my dear ones once more, clasped in their mother's heart as in the days of yore. Come to the capital of North Carolina, and you will find your mother there, eagerly awaiting her loved ones. Hugh Outlaw, if you should have any information for all of my children, you will do me an incalculable favor by immediately informing me that their mother still lives.
I heard indirectly a while after I got here that my children were brought to Austin, Texas and carried from there to New Orleans. Since then, I've heard nothing from them. I have 2 children born since my stay in Texas. The girl is Josephine. The boy was William Henry, who died a few years ago. I desire that all pastors and reader of this inquiry will try to find them for me. I'm old, and my health has failed me. Only a few more days remain to me upon earth, and I want to find my children and have them come where I am to take my property into their hands. I'm trying to follow Jesus. I've been a member of the ME Church 20 years. My daughter is also a member of the same church. If I do not meet them again on earth, I trust I shall meet them in heaven. Address, Charlotte Harbord, care of Reverend R.H. Harbord, Lockett, Caldwell County, Texas.
Mr. Editor, I desire some information about my mother. I last saw her in Alexandria, Virginia, about the year 1852 or 1853. Her name is Hannah. She belonged to Lawyer Tibbs, who sold her when I was quite young to a slave trader named Brother. Lawyer Tibbs lived in Leesburg, Virginia, and afterward moved to Alexandria, Virginia, where he sold Mother to Brother and traded me for another boy. Brother put me in jail, and I cried. And he said if I would hush, he would bring Mother to see me the next morning.
Mr. Editor, I wish to inquire for my children. I was sold from them in Virginia by a man by the name of Steve Webb to a man named Watkins, and he brought me to Franklin, Louisiana. I have 4 children, which I left in Virginia. The oldest is named Simon. He used to belong to Thomas Joplin. My next oldest were Emma and Ann, one of whom I left at the old home, and Emma belonged to a man by the name of Noel. Jimmy, my youngest, I left with my old owners. I now have 2 of them, Emma and Annie, but Simon and Jimmy I have not found. Address me at Franklin, Louisiana, care of our pastor, Reverend J.W. Hilton. My name is Martha Badner, but I used to be called Martha Webb.
Information wanted of Samuel Holland by his son, Dennis Holland. Samuel Holland was a slave to Captain George Gaither of Montgomery County, Maryland. He was married to Rachel Bright, having two sons, Stephen and Dennis. The last heard of him was August 22nd, 1817 AD. If anybody knowing of his whereabouts or can give any information concerning him will be greatly obliged by this writer by addressing Dennis Holland, Ellicott City, Howard County, Maryland, shoemaker, bootmaker, and member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Mr. Editor, I wish to inquire for my kin people. I left them in South Carolina about the year 1851. My husband was William Stokes Dozier. He belonged to Allen Dozier, a Baptist preacher. I have two boys, John Wesley Dozier and Willis Dozier. I was sold from them by Johnson Lowry to Sam Watson. Watson sold me to Paul Delameyer in Sumter County, Alabama. My mother's name was Maria Brooks. I left her in Mount Willing City, South Carolina. She belonged to a Dr. George Yardy. My father, John Brooks, belonged to Smith Brooks. Before I left South Carolina, I had 5 brothers and 2 sisters. Brothers George Coleman and Richard Reuser, Philip Christie, Willis Christie, and John Brooks. I left them in Edgefield, South Carolina. My sisters, Amy and Eliza, I heard from during the war. My name is now Maria Freeman. Address me, Edwards, Harris County, Mississippi, care of Mr. P.W. Baldwin.
Information wanted of my people. My mother was sold from me when I could but crawl. She belonged to Jim Finley in Dade County, Missouri. I had 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Mother's name was Cicely Finley. When sold, she was taken to Arkansas. At the age of 3 years, Jim Finley's father gave me to Dave Long's wife. I never saw any of my people. I was about 19 years last March and am married and living at Panama, Vernon County, Missouri. My name is Mary Delaney. It used to be Mary Long. Address me at Post Office, Panama, Vernon County, Missouri.
Eliza Holmes, information wanted of my husband and son. We separated in Richmond, Virginia in 1860. My son's name was James Monroe Holmes. My husband's name was Frank Holmes. My son was sold in Richmond, Virginia. I don't know where they carried him to. My husband was not sold. I left him in Richmond, Virginia, and I and 5 children, Henry, Gabriel, Charles, Dorothy, and Jacob, were sold to a trader in Texas. I am now old, and I don't think that I'll be here long, and I would like to see them before I die. Any information concerning them would be thankfully received by Eliza Holmes, Flatonia, Fayette County, Texas.
I desire to find my mother and sister who used to belong to Mr. Angelo Steele. My mother's name was Sarah Steele, and my sister's Harriet Steele. I was carried from Huntsville to Canton, Mississippi during the war, and have never seen or heard from them since. until my return to Huntsville, August 20th, in search of them, where I learned my mother married a man at Bridgeport, Alabama by the name of Johnny, and since then he died. Write me at 1237 Farragut Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, where I now live. Or leave notice with the editor of paper. Greatly obliged, Alvin Steele.
Brother put me in jail and I cried. And he said if I would hush, he would bring Mother to see me the next morning, which he did. But I was so young, Mother hardly knew me. So Brother put 4 or 5 boys in a row and asked which one was her boy. Mother stood for a moment and then said I was her boy. She then brought me cake and candy, and that was the last time I saw her. I now go by the name Henry Tibbs. I remember 2 of the Tibbs sons, Abner and Kennedy. Brother brought me to New Orleans, Louisiana, where he sold me to a man named M. Pickett. If Mother is found, please address me in Deasonsville in Yazoo County, Mississippi, in care of Reverend David Allen. Henry Tibbs.
I wish to find my child, Fred F. Carter, Chicago, Illinois. We last saw our child in Chicago, but he was last seen in San Francisco, California. You would do a great favor if you could tell of his whereabouts to me, his mother. I'm Mrs. Elsie Carter, 3736 Abner Avenue in Chicago, Illinois.
Dear editor, I desire to find my son. 30 years ago, at the age of 6 years, he was sold away from me at Covington, Kentucky. He was sold to Richard K. by John N. Howard. His name then was LeGrand Howard. His complexion is very fair. I have seen him but once since the next year after he was sold. Any information concerning him, should this not meet his eye, will be gratefully received by his aged and anxious mother. Direct in care of Mr. B. Graves, 320 West 5th Street, Cincinnati, Ohio. Caroline Howard.
Mr. Editor, allow me to inquire for a relative of mine. It is my child. She was sold from me when about 10 years old. We were formerly servants of Elizabeth Hoofers. Her name was Sarah Frances Brown. My name at that time was Eliza Fry. She was carried south by a man named McGill and was sold to a man in Haywood named Harvey Curry. This was about 8 or 9 years before the rebellion. I had strict account that she was there up until that time. I have been seeking for her ever since we have been free. We both resided in the city of Louisville, Kentucky, in which I still remain. She is my only child. My name at present is Eliza Gay, resident 1536
Kentucky Street, between 15th and 16th Street, Louisville, Kentucky.
Do you know him? I desire information about the whereabouts of my son, George Cananis. When last heard from, he was working in Philadelphia. Any information concerning his whereabouts will be gratefully received by his mother, who desires him to return home.
Your Honor, you will kindly inform me, if you can, of the whereabouts of my relatives living in your city. My mother's name was Minta Whaley. She was owned by Captain Peter Whaley. I am 101 years of age, to the best of my knowledge. There are relatives of mine living in your city or some proximity. I am very anxious to get direct correspondence with them. Anything you can do for me, an ex-slave, will be highly appreciated. This is the only way left open to me. You will kindly locate for me the Whaley family, if that is more convenient for you. I am anxious to see some of my people, white or black, before I die. Humbly yours, Anne Whaley.
I'm Mrs. Clara Bastian of Morristown, New Jersey. For 33 years, I have been searching for my daughter, Patience. Through all those years, I worked and searched. If she is still alive, Patience would be a grown woman now. I thought she may have moved up north after the war, so I renewed my search in New York. For many months, I searched the great city, renewing my ads in the paper. Still no news ever came of my missing girl. I've now moved to Morristown, New Jersey, where I've been employed at the Cold Bath House in Morristown for many years. I will remain here, still hopeful that I will find my lost girl. She was last seen near Charles City Courthouse.
I was taken from my mother when I was 6 years old. I am now 34 years old and have been in search of her for the last 28 years.
My people live in St. Charles County, Missouri, when I was sold for cutting off 2 fingers of my young boss's hand. I would like to inform Mrs. Eliza Park that she is Mrs. Eliza Husher.
Mother said I was her boy. She brought me cake and candy, and that was the last time I saw her.
I'm Mrs. Clara Bashop of Morristown, New Jersey. For 33 years, I have been searching for my daughter, Patience. She was last seen.
try to provide more ways for the archive to better serve educators. And this art competition is part of it. So the vision was to provide a more accessible way for the students to be able to interact with these advertisements, and to create historical empathy through open artistic interpretation and expression. And the results have been fantastic. A lot of these students don't only show skill with composition, but also nuanced understanding of racial and gender themes and the history and legacy of slavery. So I just want to, first of all, thank all those students for getting involved. There's many people to be thanked, but I just want to thank Dr. Giesberg and Dr. Valerie Joyce for their brilliance and their devotion to this project and production. And also Francis Burns of the History Department and Dr. Tim McCall for his keen insight. And also Ms. Myra Smoot of Tilden Middle School, and Mr. Charles Henberry of Lower Marion High School for bringing the Last Scene Project into their classrooms and producing a lot of great art and advocating for their students. So again, thank you for coming out. Thank you for coming out, and I hope you enjoy the talk back.
So I think Valerie is going to join us too on part of the talk back, right? Do you already know her, and him is also welcome you all. So I will go down the line here and introduce people to you who are part of the talkback. So we're all here to talk with you about what you just experienced. So immediately all the way to stage right. I can't do the stage thing. Or stage right. Left. Stage left. Okay, right here. Jim Casey, who is a professor at Princeton University. Is also a member of the Colored Conventions Project, which is a digitization project and a crowdsourcing transcription project. And so that's Jim Casey. And then this is Mia Bay, to his right, professor at the History Department at the University of Pennsylvania. And our very own Shannon Williams, professor in the History Department here at Villanova University. I'm Judy Giesberg. I teach in history as well, and you all know Valerie Joyce, the director of this project. So thank you all again for coming. And I guess we can start with if any of you wanted to say anything about what you thought of this project, this performance, or if you wanted to pose a question for the audience.
I thought it was amazing. I read the ad and read books about people for their parents, relatives, but it was amazing to see actual people talk about it and also think about what they were saying, how long they looked. It was just very moving.
I've had some of the experiences reading most of these ads. It's hard material. I mean, you read them, and especially the ones that go on for decades, you think it's such a difficult thing. And you think, oh my God, where is the openness? And I think that's something that the performers really show us. In these ads, it's not just a kind of philosophy. It's a really kind of strength and perseverance. And even the shortest of the ads.
I think for me, what was most jarring was the fact that even after the abolition of slavery, that trauma continued, with people continuing to have to look for family members, to remember that people did not let that go immediately after the abolition of slavery, that it stayed with so many people, particularly if they were attempting to reconstitute their families. Certainly it forced me to think about my own family, because we do know that history, and I do know the name of my ancestor who was sold from Virginia, and it's why my father's family is in Arkansas, and his name was John Harris. And so to know that my family is a part of this particular second middle passage, and to think about those family members that we perhaps left behind. And quite frankly, I was actually sort of listening for the name. Is anybody looking for John Harris? Because that's the name that we know in Arkansas.
So now it's all your turn. What kinds of thoughts did you have, or questions did you want the panelists to weigh in on?
Judy, is
is the material all like in certain kinds of newspapers, or was it, it seemed to be directed so far away in some cases, you know, that somebody was writing from Maryland to pastors in Louisiana, you know, so was it a national paper of some kind that was doing this, or?
Yeah, the project right now, or the collection right now, includes over 100 newspapers that were published all over the country. So they're, so some of these are very short-lived black newspapers. Others are newspapers that are still being published today, like the Christian Reporter, which is published out of the AME Church as the official mouthpiece of the AME Church. The Chicago Defender, which didn't even start until the 20th century, they included these ads. And everything in between. So these are some newspapers that really were only around for a couple of years that would show up in a where there was a large enough black community to sustain a church and then a newspaper. They would start, a newspaper would last for a couple of years, and no matter where these newspapers appeared, they were filled with these ads. We were shocked to discover these ads still in the 20th century. When we first started this project, people came to us and said, at one of the first times we spoke about it, said, have you ever looked in the Chicago Defender? And we thought they must have been mistaken. There couldn't have been ads in the 19-teens, 1920s. And then we looked and there were.
We are treated in the piece with one or two success stories, which nurture your hope that some of these will work out. Is there in the archives, what sort of evidence of the success of some of these searches is there?
Very little. We have about 4,000 ads now, and we have just a handful of follow-up ads or ads that announce somebody who's found. We do have an interesting cluster of reunion ads that appear in white newspapers in the late 19th century, sort of 1880s, 1890s, and we're not sure, we're sort of categorizing them separately because they seem to be a different phenomenon. Sometimes they're not even giving exact names, so we're not sure that that's even the same genre or the same thing because they seem to be about sort of feel-goodism, but in the black newspapers that form the real collection is black newspapers, very few, just a couple hundred maybe, less than that.
There were several in the voice of the editor that were interesting to me to use, but I ended up not using them because they spoke of husbands and wives who were lost to one another remarrying. And so there are a couple of husbands and wives that were in the performance that we thought might be really interesting to have them do that, but everyone was written not in their own voice, so I rejected that. But that is an interesting set of them.
And just to add on to that, I mean, there are other examples beyond the newspapers where we do know that families are reconstituted. For example, some slave narratives write about reunions with particular family members. In the case of the narrative of Louis Hughes, and even in family records, for those of you who were with us for our kickoff event for Black History Month, we brought in Sister Clara Billings, and when she was giving over papers to me, and she was Philadelphia's first black nun, the first accepted into the Religious Sisters of Mercy. So she is the great-granddaughter of William Henry Lee, who was one of the slaves owned by the Jesuits at Georgetown. In the family history, that there was an oral history of the younger sister of William Lee, who was taken, I guess, at the turn of the 20th century, that she had in her papers. The family history said that he also had two brothers that were sold away, George and then another one who was sold away because he fought an overseer, and another one who had run away but was caught. In the family history, they find that the family, one of the brothers, George, had written back to the family he had been sold to Mississippi, and then wrote back to the family and found out that they had migrated to Philadelphia, and so the family does have that history. They knew what happened to him, although they never saw him again, but there was a correspondence that had been preserved in the family. So there's also this other piece of story, right? Like there might be other personal archives, family archives, where we do have these reconstitutions. Unfortunately, it still seems like there are very few.
The AME Church is a connectional church. So the Christian Recorder wasn't just a newspaper from on high. It was the way we connected with one another. And if you notice in some of the ads, they asked the pastor to speak from pulpit, which was that connectional issue. So the pastors in the AME church only stayed at church for a year. They always moved. So that was part of the reason Christian Dakota had so many.
To ask about where we see the future of this project going, both the piece, do we hope to refine this piece, do it again? That's the end. But also as the nature of the whole project, what is one of the ultimate goals of collecting all of these? Are we hoping to not only expand it into the educational venue or do more research? What is that ultimate goal?
Of the performance?
Both.
Of both. I can say the original goal of the performance, well, the original goal of the performance was just to be in a space where everybody got to hear them out loud, and then everything else grew from there. And then the current goal, to speak for both of us, is that we could find a way to make the digital archive accessible enough with a structure that is basic enough that any school could really manage this kind of a performance in their own schools, or community centers or churches or whoever wanted to. I think the structure was super simple, and genuinely almost everyone chose their own ad because it was a name that they recognized, a place that they recognized, a story that touched them, and that's something that any group can do.
As far as the archive goes, that's a really hard question to answer. Our original goal was to try to get to 2,000, I think, or even 1,000, and we're at 4,000. People stopped asking how many ads there are out there. That was when they asked us this 4 years ago or something when we started this. I'm not exactly sure I have an answer for you about it. It goes on as long as the history department tolerates and allows graduate students to sort of devote some of their time that they are working in the department on it. And the goal from the beginning was to get these stories into people's hands that they formed part of their family histories. These were sort of behind paywalls or hidden in microfilm, and what we wanted from the beginning was to get these stories out so people could use them for genealogy and for research. And then we wanted people to connect with them, in a space like this, creatively and emotionally. And we've been working with some graduate students in the history department to produce curriculum to use in classrooms. We had early adopters. I don't know if Myra Smoot is here. She's our middle school teacher. She's one of the first people to sort of enthusiastically call the history department and said, I really want to use these in my classroom. So from the beginning, we saw the potential of bringing them into the classroom. So those are some of the directions that it could possibly go, depending on what kind of, depending on what the future holds.
I just wanted to make a suggestion about that. A number of years ago, when I was a film editor, I worked on this project where we were taking historical things and using lots of different kind of media, but putting it together to be some kind of interactive thing. It didn't quite work out, but what was really interesting was that they got a number of people, well-known actors, to read pieces that they then filmed or videotaped and then just had as an archive, so that anybody who had access to that archive could just, see it. And this might be something that you all might want to think about doing.
Yeah, I have a fantasy about, we have a thing called the cave here at Villanova, which is a 3-dimensional experience. And I do have a fantasy about each one of these people filming one shortly and using the music that was written for tonight and making that an opportunity that all of Villanova could experience in 10-minute, 15-minute chunks.
It does come alive theatrically, really. It's very expressive, very emotional, and I second the motion on that type of thing.
I just wanted to say that at the end, that was very powerful. Because seeing them individually is one thing, and you were able to kind of absorb it. But when everybody came, it really made you know there were so many millions looking for their families. And you know, just the tragedy of it all, and how they really persevered under, we think, conditions like we live. No, these were very adverse conditions for people, and just to see that was just powerful. And I really hope we keep that with the numbers of people that came, because that really impacts. Pretty good.
Did I understand you to say that the Jesuits had slaves?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right.
I did not know that.
So, the Catholic Church was like any other American institution that they held slaves. Religious orders of men and women owned slaves. So much of early American Catholic history is actually African American history. When we sort of think about who actually built much of the earliest sort of structures of the church, we sort of forget about this. I mean, I do work on Black Catholic nuns, so we even have examples of Black women who were held in slavery by the church and then who literally became sisters, right? For those of you who are familiar with the Oblate Sisters of Providence, which is the nation's first successful community of Black sisters, also the first successful community in the Western world. We know that at least 10 women who sort of literally marched from the plantation with their food and papers and made their way to the convent. So we're literally talking thousands of people, and certainly when we're thinking about Latin America, certainly if you would have visited some of these convents, the vast majority of the people that you would have seen there would have been enslaved persons. I mean, it's a history that certainly has not yet been fully told, but very much. For those of you who are familiar, I mean, Georgetown recently apologized. They are beginning to sort of atone for their past. They created a center to study, but most people are sort of focused on that 1832 sale of 232 enslaved men, women, and children. In addition to sort of building a center for the study of slavery, they've renamed the halls after, I guess, the first person who was listed on that manifest, and then also after a free woman of color who later became an Oblate Sister of Providence, Anne Marie B. Craft. So there is a significant history there. And I think we sort of get this in other spaces as well. Certainly if you're familiar with the ongoing canonization cause of Augustus Tolton, he's also very much a part of that story of separation as well, particularly in the case of his mother. To remember that his mother is sold as a teenager from Kentucky, from Catholic Kentucky into Illinois, marries his father, and then at the start of the war, his father goes off to fight for the Union Army, whereas the mother marches her 3 children to freedom from Missouri to Illinois. But they are born into slavery. So we do have those cases, but I think that certainly there is more research to be done, but it's very much a history that is with us.
Before you go to another thread, do you have a resource on that?
On the history of Catholic slaveholding or the Jesuits, I mean, you can certainly go to their website. It was a New York Times study. I mean, it's a wonderful New York Times article. They've actually located some of the descendants of those who were sold, and they went through a formal apology with them. So if you just sort of Google that, you'll be able to find a lot of the information. And then I think it's even the Slavery Reconciliation Project at Georgetown. But they are one of many Catholic institutions. There are Catholic sisterhoods in Kentucky who have apologized. They've built sort of monuments to the enslaved, naming those that were owned by the orders in Kentucky, the Sisters of Loretto, the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, and there's another one. But when we're talking about sort of 19th century, sort of 18th century, Ursulines, the visitations in DC and beyond, there's going to be slaveholding there at any turn.
The hall that was named after the first slave owner manifest, just a little fun fact, Esaphat Mergerson, that's her 3rd great-grandfather.
Oh, wow.
So I was just, to our guests, all of our guests, I was just curious to know, so I hadn't heard it all out loud until tonight like all of us. And I'm just curious to know your work, your research with these ads, things like that. Themes that you see over and over again, things rang out to me across the whole evening. I'm just wondering what jumped out at you from the context of what you do.
Well, I thought about Ida B. Wells, the Black actress who I wrote a biography of. She grew up watching her mother write letters, looking for her sisters. And she's another one of those stories of failure. And it was sort of upsetting as a child to just watch, you know, this very hardworking woman take a day each week and just write letters that never ever brought anything back. But her mother knew only that her family had been sold to Texas, so she was writing anywhere she thought they might have ended up. But I also thought, I thought about the impact of this history of failure on families. I also thought about, which I think is perhaps good and bad, there's a strong history of Black family reunion. People did rebuild kinship networks. But there was also ways, and this is true of my own family, where my mother said that her grandmother would never talk about slavery times, wouldn't even say whether they had been free or slave, though they were in Virginia, so yes, perhaps enslaved. It was just like, she just didn't want to look back. And I wonder whether sometimes not wanting to look back is about those terrible losses.
I think one of the things that really struck out to me, I work on the history of newspapers, which now seem like this kind of old, maybe a lot of young people learning to run across newspapers anymore. But we have to remember that newspapers and post offices actually, in many places, were still actually pretty new. And if we understand that, then when we hear the little notes that say, contact me at this post office, or will the Reverend read it in this church, or will people write to this paper, it's actually a really complicated, sophisticated way of working with new technologies and networks and circuits and being able to reach out to lots of different people, right? And so, today it just, it does sound kind of familiar, but back then, these were still relatively new newspapers sometimes, new towns, right? We hear about some of the communities in Kansas and Ohio, right, that didn't exist until the 1870s, until the 1880s, right? These free Black communities, that were founded, intentionally, where people were moving to. And so we also got, along with the technology, a kind of geography of the United States through these letters. We really see where, maybe folks had families that started in the Upper South and then moved down, further south, or moved further west, or moved to Texas, which is, some of these corners that, if we do get slavery taught in our schools now, don't get included. Right? The history of Texas is a big one. Really, really in-depth.
Yeah, it's striking too. Isabella Wilkerson, didn't she say something along the lines of, she was talking about the Great Migration and said that was the first time American servant class didn't moved without asking permission or something. And as you're reading these ads, you're getting that, you're getting this sense of great movement, out of the South into all of those places that you just listed, and then sort of a reaching back as they're looking for family members that who are still in the South or who they left behind or whatever. So there's this great spread.
West Africa, California.
Yeah.
Right? These are not really local histories. We say, oh, it's just Virginia.
But also there's such an impact of the massive slave sales that took place during the antebellum era, because they were the most destructive in terms of being able to find your kin, because the people, when they sold, were generally quite young, teenagers, sometimes even children. The old folks stayed at home. So just in terms of knowing who they were and knowing where the family was very difficult for people who were sold down south or out west of Texas.
I know, yeah. What struck me was even sort of the naming practices. On the one hand, that there are some people who are attempting to sort of remove themselves from slavery altogether and choose a new name, whether it's Freeman or Turnipseed. But also, I was just reminded of sort of the necessity of perhaps keeping the name of the master for mere purposes of being able to locate one, or if someone may be looking for you, that you have to hold on to this name as well. That really struck me in ways. I oftentimes wonder why we didn't change our name, but then I also understand in certain ways why we held on to it for those purposes of reconnection that I never really considered until I began reading the ads.
Yeah, the Hagar Outlaw ad particularly is like that, because not only is every one of her names, her children's name outlaw, but then everyone who took her children children were also named Outlaw. And then at the end, when she comes back, it says, and Hugh Outlaw, who was clearly either the father of all of them. It's just unpacking that as we rehearsed it. It just became clearer and clearer and clearer who all of these people were and what they were doing.
I asked in rehearsal, I wondered if any of those folks were related to Lucius Outlaw. I mean, immediately that's what it, and it made me, I was like, somebody needs to contact him and give him that ad. I mean, just a contemporary moment like that.
Right there.
So I noticed that some of the ads were very short and some of them were fairly long. Do you know if the people who took out the ads would have had to pay some sort of cost?
That's good, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, that was a really good question. So some of the papers did charge a fee for taking out these ads, and then others openly advertised that these were free because it was a service they were doing. So the Christian Reporter is an example. You paid for an ad, and then with that, whatever you paid for it, you got a subscription like for a year or something like that. And then sometimes they package them like some of these ads repeat, so you could buy, you could buy more than one. So if it show up, a few months in a row, an ad could show up. So there seems to have been a great variety in the way that these papers work. Sometimes you did have to pay, and then other times papers just said, this is something we're doing, as a service, as part of, being part of this community. So you can imagine that. And then there's also variation in, some of them are, like Valerie said, some of them are written in the first person and some of them are written in the third person. You probably noticed that. So we don't know whether or not those are people choosing to write about themselves in the third person, or if there's somebody working with, if they're going somewhere and somebody's helping them write it, or they're writing it with a minister, or a newspaper editor. There's a lot of questions we don't know about the way the ads appear. There's also interesting things too with, I'll stop after this, sorry. That was the last example. There's interesting differences in some of the ads. We found a cluster of ads in which they put terms like owned by in quotation marks, which is really interesting. So somebody took out an ad saying, I'm looking for my son who was owned by, and other terms like that in parentheses, which, we'd love to know why. We have our suspicions about what that means, but who is making that choice to editorialize that way? Is that is that the parent or the family member searching, or is that the editor of the newspaper? So there's a lot of questions about sort of what happens from the person taking out the ad to the newspaper. So I'll stop.
I want to know what happened with the New York Herald too. Someone from the New York Herald, which is this is overgeneralizing, but basically the Fox News.
Yeah.
A massively popular newspaper.
Yeah.
Right, where ads were really expensive and could only run for a day or two.
Yeah.
Right? So that was somebody really betting all of the marbles.
Yeah.
On this national newspaper.
Yep.
With a pretty basis.
Yeah. And that's some of the news, that's where we found some of these suspect very happy reunion stories. And then a bunch of these white newspapers in the Midwest, all of a sudden they were, after 75 years, they meet each other passing in the street and they remarry. And they're one after the other, just for a short period of time, but they're showing up in these white newspapers where the audience is all white, and you have to wonder why, why is that there, and yeah.
I was just wondering, given what you just said, were there ever any oral histories taken around journalism and newspaper articles during that time?
Yeah, there's some great stuff. I would encourage everybody to look, as long as we're doing stuff to Google. There was a man named Irvine Garland Penn who wrote a doorstopper of a book, I think when he was 22 years old. And it's a history of the African American press, written in 1892 or something like that. And it's a lot of his contemporaries his contemporaries, sort of fathers and grandfathers, is mostly men of the 19th century whose names got recorded, and we know plenty of women were involved. And it's a fascinating history. It gives us just these little kind of sketches of everybody, but if you read through a bunch of them, you can realize that a lot of times he was writing so-and-so and saying, hey, what year did you start that newspaper, and what were you guys thinking at the time? And so we get all these kind of layers of how they thought about using the press and how. You know, of course, we have folks that have Wells.
Yeah, then we have Wells, yeah.
There's a great book recently about the Chicago Defender, too.
Right.
Another sort of great history, which is starting to be told.
Why were some ads picked over other ads?
Honestly, well, there's two answers to that question. I would say that 70% people chose their own ads. So a school, the Performing Arts School of Baltimore, sent their sophomore class up, and they all chose ads that they were interested in that had to do with Baltimore or mentioned something in Anne Arundel County or things like that. The kids from Tilden Middle School chose their own ads. And then for those who were open to other things or didn't want to choose an ad, I had two great dramaturgs who worked on the project with me, alums of the theater program, Marissa, and I don't know if Grecian's still at Grecian. And they worked very hard to both transcribe ads that hadn't been transcribed yet and to choose based on the appeal. So they would work with each actor and say, what are you looking for? What are you interested in? Are you interested in looking? Do you have a brother? Are you interested in a mother? Things like that. So it was a combination. And then Clara is the one that when I first started reading the ads, Clara's repeated ads over 33 years were the thing that made me say, oh, there's a narrative arc to this that might be really interesting. Just the magnitude of searching for your daughter for 33 years and still hoping at the end is how that one was chosen.
So I happen to have done a couple of transcriptions. You're talking about national conventions. Is that still going on, or has it been completed, or what's the status of it now?
I promise I didn't pay attention. Yes, let me do the 30-second version of that. So I'm part of a large collaborative group that's based in Delaware, but all across the country, that are trying to bring back the history of what were called colored conventions, which were state and national level meetings that started about 1830 and go up till about when the NAACP starts. And it was about every issue under the sun that you could think of, where black communities got together and tried to sort of figure out how to act as a community and how to agitate and advocate all these wonderful things. And so for the last 7 years, we've been a kind of sister project with the last city folks, trying to find documents in something like 100 different archives. I mean, it's, you know, when you hear about these projects, it's everywhere. We recently had somebody who found that there were 7 of these conventions. If anybody has roots in Iowa, where maybe I didn't think there was a lot of black history, but it turns out there was actually a huge amount. And so if you just look us up, collegeconventions.org, follow us on social media. No, I'm really doing that myself. And so right now we are in the process of developing a whole new system for folks to come and help transcribe and really get to kind of engage with the materials. And I will also give a shout out to another project that's just about to start around the papers of Annie Julie Cooper, based out of Howard. That's also going to be inviting the transcribers. That will hopefully go up online in the next couple of months, fingers crossed. And you know, there's a sort of larger point there too that I'd love to sort of point out, which is that, you know, artistic, digital, technology, archives, all this kind of swirl of work that's going on. There's a sort of thing that's happening right now. There's so much of this work that's going on where it's not that we just have to watch documentaries and read a book and, you know, just sort of let it, you know, sit in our heads. But there's lots of projects where there's places to get involved. There's another huge project that's going on right now for the African American troops in the Civil War, where we have 300,000 names that are on these documents.
And they just, I think they finished the Freedmen's Bureau. I don't know if the Freedmen's Bureau's.
I was going to say, the Freedmen's Bureau is 1.5 million pages.
So they're never going to finish it.
And then one more I would add is that the African American Museum in DC is digitizing people's home movies.
Yeah.
Because they want the footage, but they'll digitize it for you and then give you back the original.
Yeah, if you've got old
And
tapes,
all the
old
copies.
videos, and you go down to DC, take them with you, they will digitize them. It's this really kind of cool, high-tech, old-school computer little room, and then they give you a thumb drive that looks like the museum.
Yeah.
So if you go to DC, bring your stuff. But thank you for that.
Thank you. In the theatrical space, often said that one of the points of theater is like start a conversation. And I was wondering what conversation we're trying to start with this, and what we should walk out here. So I guess, sorry, from a performer and then also.
It strikes me that we haven't learned, you know, what happens to people when you separate them from their families, and the trauma that is experienced by that generation, but how that trauma can be passed along to the next generation. And we still, you know, this was all sort of, this was not sort of illegal. This was legal. Every one of these million sales in the Second Middle Passage was illegal, open, right? We have lots of records to tell us how it was done, and laws that protected it, and we're doing it again. And, you know, we're creating another generation of people who are gonna have to live down a trauma. So for me, you know, it's not just the past. Although obviously it's the past. It's the present. It's the, you know, it's the ancestors who are still trying to find you know, holes in their family tree, still trying to heal those wounds, and then it's a whole new generation of people who are doing, you know, this is happening all over again.
And I would quickly say that my intention was when I teach the teaching of theater, and one of the big questions in there is why do we teach theater? Why is theater even in something that we do at a university? Why is that something that we should major in? And this is one of the best examples of why theater, because it's different than sitting and looking at the ad on your phone. Just being in the space with all of you, saying the words out loud, you receiving them, us receiving the energy back from you, and then having this conversation, because each and every one of you has probably had some conversation while rehearsing this or discovering this, and then hopefully you'll have conversations with one another, and it's about how we are as humans, who we are as humans, how we behave, how we avoid problems from the past in our current life. So that's, and any of the above, I would say.
I just had a quick question and a longer thing that I want you guys to address. There was, I did Alvin Steele, and on the original, it said 2MO at the bottom. Do you guys know what, was that like 2 months that he could have that ad in there?
Yes.
Is that what that meant?
Yes, I think so. That those, when those notes were at the bottom of the ads, it usually meant that it was some indication that it was, especially in the Christian Reporter, they used that notation to say that the ad was going to run for that many months.
Okay, and the other thing is really sensitive, and people will probably get mad at me when I say this, but you know, I don't care, I'm old. This is a very sensitive topic. There are, I'll just put it this way to try to make it less controversial. There are groups that make absolutely sure that their group, the children of their group and generations of their group understand what happened to them in the past. As researchers, as someone who cares about it, finding that so many black people, for reasons of I don't want to traumatize my kids, I don't want to deal with it, I don't want whatever, didn't pass on these stories. So there's like all these gaps. And so the question I had was, you know, as historians, how do we combat that? I mean, part of the problem that we have now, and I'm sorry to go into this, but part of the problem we have now in these United States are that young people don't know shit about what is going on, what has happened. And it's not totally their fault, because so many of our parents, our grandparents, and this is why I brought up the question, because of what the lady in blue said earlier about people not wanting to talk about it. Well, there are groups that talk about it all the time, and they've got historical documents and you know, all kinds of media that can talk about what happened to them. And we don't have that. And I just wonder, as historians, you know, am I crazy, or, you know, I'm sorry, but it's just, it's a problem.
I would just jump in and say not all kids don't know shit.
Well, no, but I mean, I'm talking about from a national.
I mean, our students at Villanova are very curious about this history, and they're very willing to talk about these difficult things. I mean, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess part of the answer is that, like, people have to choose what they want to tell. If they don't want to tell stories that are painful, and they don't want to pass along that information to their children, then that's a choice too. That's a way that they are.
It's a choice that is hurting us.
But also,
as a people.
the amnesia takes place within a complex political and social environment. They didn't even teach African American history in schools until quite recently. And the sort of history of slavery was something some people, some generations were taught to be ashamed of. You know, I think we have to remember how relatively recent all this history is, the ongoing racism and the environment in which people are dealing with it, and I think we have to try to do better, but I don't think we need to condemn our parents and grandparents for their own choices. I think they probably did the best they could, and it's up to our generation to try to do better. Which is why we're all encouraging you to participate.
I think we have time for just maybe.
We had an actor over here who's been waiting patiently. So.
Well, thank you for the. Well, have you ever received any documents or any correspondence with artists? This project reminds me of the work or tangential work of one of my friends, Samantha Hill. She's in Chicago. As an artist, people are actually giving her their photos, their letters, memoirs, and things like that that have been passed down in their family. And they ask her to curate it as a visual
Public art
exhibition. Yeah, and then she tries to articulate, sometimes with string and like pins, to make the connections, to make that visual impact. So I was wondering if any other artists are contacting you or giving you additional information to try to fill in some of the gaps with maybe, what is it, like a cross database of sorts to match the names.
Oh yeah, and not artists. I would love it if artists. I mean, we've got a lot of high school artists who are now artists are sending us stuff, but yes, we have. As far as the database goes, we are all of this stuff is open access, and we actively seek related projects, you know, that we can sort of share data with. So there's just a recent new project that just launched in, I think on Valentine's Day, is a Freedom on the Move project, which is a project out of Cornell, which is digitizing the ads taken out by the enslavers looking for the runaways. And they've started, these projects have existed before, but this is going to be a big umbrella, ambitious effort to gather many state databases of these runaway ads. And this would be a natural, this project would be a natural one to sort of share data with, because because the names we might get some, overlap. And recently I've been working with one of the digital specialists in our library here at Villanova to share data with the Library of Congress's Federal Writers Project and interviews with former slaves. And we've now downloaded their data and our data together so we can also do the same thing and find out ways that, so those were interviews taken in the 1930s with former slaves. And now we can see if some of those names match. So we'll find, people in this 4,000 ad database and see if any of them also gave interviews to the Federal Writers Project name. So there's ways in which those things will. Does that answer your question? So it's not artists, so it's not artists, but people who are doing comparable